The first thing anyone ever noticed about Maren Wren was her hands. Not her face, which was angular and weathered in the way of women who spent more time outdoors than in. Not her voice, which carried the flat vowels of Minnesota beneath a layer of professional evenness she had spent 2 decades polishing. Her hands. The left one was missing the tip of the ring finger lost to a chisel slip at 19 during a February morning when the sandstone was cold enough to be unpredictable. The right one bore a scar that ran from the base of the thumb to the second knuckle white against skin that had been darkened by decades of sun. When she pressed those hands flat against stone, something changed in her face. The calculation behind her eyes went quiet. What replaced it was not peace exactly, but something closer to recognition. The stone was speaking in a language older than English, older than Norwegian, older than any tongue her father's father had carried across the Atlantic, and Maren Wren was one of the few living people who could hear it. She was 43 years old in the spring of 1878 when she first pressed her palm against the south-facing cliff of Harrow Creek Valley, and the cliff said everything she needed to know. Niels Wren had come from Stavanger in 1841 with a mason's vocabulary that predated formal training, a knowledge of stone acquired through generations of men who had shaped the rock coastline of western Norway into walls that outlasted the families who built them. He carried 2 chisels worn to the wood and a belief so fundamental it had never needed stating that the most honest relationship a person could maintain with the physical world was one of negotiation rather than conquest. Stone had its own logic. The mason's job was not to override that logic, but to understand it deeply enough to work within it. He built Lutheran churches in Duluth. He laid cornerstones for courthouses in St. Paul. He could look at a block of red Kasota limestone and tell you where the bedding planes ran, where the silica veins would resist the chisel, where the hidden fracture waited to betray you on the coldest morning of January when you had staked your reputation on a clean break. His daughter watched him for 7 years before she touched a tool, and when she finally picked up the smaller of his 2 chisels on a Tuesday afternoon, while he was eating his lunch on a timber pile 20 yards away, she set it against a block of sandstone he had been preparing since morning. She struck it once. The stone opened along a line so clean it might have been drawn with a rule. Niels came back from his lunch, stood over the split block for a long moment, then looked at his youngest daughter with an expression that contained both pride and the particular resignation of a man who had been hoping she would take to school teaching. Again, was what he told her. Slower. Let the tool find the grain. She spent the next 22 years doing exactly that, learning to distinguish sandstone grades by pressing her palm flat against the surface, learning which formations would carve into rooms that would last centuries, learning which would dissolve under the first hard spring runoff. She learned that stone forgave nothing but punished slowly. A small error in a foundation did not announce itself in the first season or the 5th. It waited sometimes a decade, then failed completely and without warning. By the time she was 32, Maren was the most skilled mason in a 4-county radius of Duluth, executing contracts that went to men with her credentials while she carried out the actual craft. She did not resent this arrangement with the bitterness that a younger version of herself might have sustained. She understood it as simply the structure of the world as currently arranged temporary, as bad weather and equally worth expending energy against. She kept her attention on the stone. Georg Wren died in 1873 when a scaffold gave way 3 blocks from the house where they had been married 4 years earlier. Maren heard the sound from the kitchen, a deep structural crack followed by the particular silence that falls after something large has stopped moving, and her body understood before her mind assembled the information. She was already at the door when the neighbor's son came running. She mourned Georg with the thoroughness that genuine love demands, taking the full weight of it without performance. Then she returned to work because the stone was still there. Elliot Vance came into her life in 1875 through the mechanism of a subsiding foundation at a private school in Baltimore, where he taught Roman history and medieval military architecture to boys whose families had money enough to care about such things. He had hired Maren on the recommendation of a Philadelphia contractor to assess the northeast corner of the main building, which was settling in a way that made the headmaster visibly anxious every time he walked past it. Maren examined the foundation for 18 minutes made 4 measurements with her surveying rod, wrote a brief assessment in her direct handwriting, and told the headmaster the building would be sound for 40 years, provided they redirected the east drainage pipe away from the corner's footing. Elliot had been watching from the doorway of the history department with the specific attention of a man who understood something deeply in theory and had never been close enough to touch it. He asked her 3 questions about the foundation before she reached the front gate. They were good questions, the kind that demonstrated he already held half the answer and was genuinely uncertain about the remaining half rather than performing ignorance as a social courtesy. They had dinner at a restaurant on Charles Street that evening. They married the following year. What bound them was not romance in any conventional catalog of the emotion, though that was present too, operating in the background like structural support. What bound them was rarer the recognition of a matched orientation toward permanence. Elliot had spent 2 decades studying civilizations that built things meant to outlast themselves, then watched those things outlast the civilizations. Maren had spent the same period building things designed to outlive their builders. They met in the middle of that shared understanding and found it more sustaining than sentiment. The fever that came in the 2nd year of their marriage left Maren unable to carry children. They grieved this together without assigning blame, which is harder than it sounds, and which most couples cannot manage. Then they looked at each other across the wreckage of that particular expectation and found that what remained was not consolation but actual life full-weighted worth building toward. In 1876, they took in a child, a Cheyenne girl of 4 brought to the Baltimore Charity Hospital where Agnes Finley, Maren's closest friend, a physician who had been fighting the city's medical establishment for the right to practice since 1869, worked Tuesday mornings. The child had no family anyone could locate. Her name, as best they could render it, translated approximately to the one who watches the water. They called her Rivka, a name that belonged to Elliot's grandmother, and that the child accepted with the equanimity of someone who had already renegotiated several fundamental agreements with the world. She lived with them for 11 months. She died in February 1877 of a respiratory illness that Agnes Finley fought with everything available to medicine in that year, which was not enough. Maren did not speak about Rivka after the funeral. The absence of that child had settled into her in a particular way, not as grief that faded, but as a weight that redistributed itself, changing the way she moved through the world. When she looked at children, any children, something in her posture changed by a degree too subtle for most people to measure. Elliot noticed. Agnes Finley noticed. Neither of them mentioned it because Maren had not invited discussion. It was Agnes Finley who told them about Harrow Creek in the first place, not intentionally, but through a letter from a colleague in Denver who had been treating miners for altitude sickness and had described the valley as the most geologically interesting formation in Colorado that nobody with money had yet managed to ruin. It was Elliot who found the Geological Survey report that winter, a document that dealt primarily with silver deposits, but contained as what appeared to be an afterthought 7 pages describing cliff dwellings in the canyon country of the southwestern territories, stone rooms carved into vertical rock faces by people who had since vanished, their buildings standing in near-perfect condition, while every wooden structure built by more recent arrivals had rotted or burned or simply surrendered. Elliot read the relevant sections aloud over dinner in their Baltimore row house, his voice taking on the particular quality it had when he encountered historical evidence that confirmed something he had suspected but never been able to prove. The structures faced south. Natural rock overhangs protected the entrances from rain and prevented snow accumulation at the doorways. The thermal mass of the surrounding cliff maintained interior temperatures within a narrow band year-round, regardless of what the weather was doing 3 feet away from the stone. Maren set down her fork after the first sentence and did not pick it up again until he finished reading. She was silent for a moment that Elliot, who had learned to read her silences the way she read stone, understood as containing active calculation rather than the absence of thought. "I know those buildings," she said at last. "Not those specific ones. The principle of them." She looked at the window, which was frosted at its edges from a Baltimore January that had been punishing. Friedrich Baum showed me sketches in 1874. He was surveying limestone formations outside Cincinnati. We talked for 3 hours about thermal mass. Elliot set the report on the table. "You never mentioned Baum. You never asked about Cincinnati." He looked at his wife across the dinner table with the expression of a man who had been married 4 years and was still occasionally discovering the dimensions of his own ignorance. "Then we go," he said, not a suggestion. Maren picked up her fork. In the spring, the Colorado passes are brutal until April. Harrow Creek Valley. In May of 1878 was everything a silver mining town was supposed to be: loud, provisional, optimistic in the specific way of places where money arrives fast enough that no one has begun calculating when it stops. Gunnison Street ran 6 blocks along the south bank of a cold, quick creek, lined with timber frame buildings erected with impressive speed and almost no attention to how long they were supposed to stand. The sawmill smell was everywhere. Coal smoke, horse manure, the particular sweat of men doing hard physical work in close proximity. The valley was narrow, barely 300 yards across at its widest, with sandstone cliffs rising nearly 90 feet on both sides, red-orange in the afternoon light, striated in horizontal bands that recorded 30 million years of patient geological deposition. Most of Harrow Creek looked at those cliffs the way a person in a room looks at the walls: backdrop, boundary, irrelevant to the actual business of living. Maren looked at them the way a musician looks at an instrument in a room full of people who have never heard music. The south-facing wall had a formation at approximately 20 feet that stopped her on the morning after their arrival. A natural overhang pushed 4 feet out from the cliff face, creating a shadowed alcove below it, roughly the width of a generous room. The sandstone in the alcove was the color of dried brick, dense, fine-grained, the kind that yielded to careful chisel work without crumbling. A narrow path, barely wider than a ledge, wound upward from the valley floor in a series of natural steps that a careful person could navigate without technical equipment. She stood at the base of that cliff for 50 minutes. Elliot stood beside her without speaking, because he had been with her long enough to recognize the quality of her silence, the kind that meant she was running numbers that had nothing to do with mathematics. The land office on Gunnison Street occupied a single room with a potbelly stove going hard despite the mild morning. Behind the desk sat Roy Pratt, the county's land registrar, a lean, precise man in his late 30s whose wire-rimmed spectacles gave him an air of exactitude that his filing system only intermittently supported. He had a habit of tilting his head slightly when confronted with something he found difficult to categorize. He deployed this gesture now as Maren set her finger on his survey map and indicated the section of South Cliff containing the overhang. That section, the alcove formation under the natural overhang, is, it claimed. Pratt tilted his head at its maximum angle. "Nobody's ever claimed any of the cliff sections. There's no ore worth pulling from there." He paused. "What are you interested in building something?" Maren's tone was level, carrying no edge. "Building something that works." Pratt looked at the cliff section visible through the office's single north-facing window, a stripe of shadow below the overhang unremarkable from this distance. He collected the $4 filing fee with the expression of a man accepting payment for something he suspected was a mistake but could find no legal basis to prevent. As Maren folded her receipt into her coat pocket, she paused at the door with her hand on the frame, not for effect, because she was not a person who manufactured effects, but because something accurate had occurred to her that seemed worth saying. "Mr. Pratt, there was an inquiry about this section before mine. A man named Coldwell." Pratt's head tilted again, differently this time. "James Coldwell. Asked about it in November of last year. Said he was thinking about it. Then I didn't see him again." He picked up a pen. "Far as I know, he left town." Maren looked at the cliff through the window. "Far as you know," she said, and stepped outside. She told Elliot about Coldwell that evening on the ledge path, picking her way upward in the last of the afternoon light to examine the alcove up close for the first time. He listened, then asked the natural question, "Why does it matter?" "It matters because someone else saw what I see. Either they were right about it and failed, or they were wrong about it and walked away." She pressed her palm against the alcove's back wall and held it there. The stone was still warm from a full day of south-facing sun releasing its stored heat in the patient way of dense material that does not distinguish between generosity and physics. "I want to know which." She found the answer within the first 2 weeks of assessment. In the deepest section of the alcove, behind what would become the back wall of the main room, there were chisel marks recent enough to be distinct, old enough to have collected a thin film of red dust. Someone had made 11 strikes into this rock-testing, depth-testing grain direction. The strikes were not incompetent, they were exploratory. Whoever James Coldwell was, he had understood the principle and lacked the refinement. He had started recognized his own insufficiency and stopped. Maren ran her finger along one of his cuts. The grain direction he had identified was correct. The angle he had chosen was wrong by about 8 degrees, not catastrophically, but enough to waste material and compromise load distribution over time. She picked up her own chisel, positioned it at the correct angle, and made her first strike into the stone that would become Lodgestone Shelf. The sound was clean. The crack ran exactly where she intended. Construction began the first week of June 1878 and would not finish until August 1879. Maren worked at the pace of someone who had internalized at a level below conscious principle that speed and permanence were competing ambitions, and that any craftsperson who failed to choose between them was lying to their client, to themselves, or to both. She had brought from Baltimore her father's 2 oldest chisels, worn smooth at the handles from 40 years of his hands before hers, 3 of her own. A mason's hammer with a hickory handle she had replaced twice in the past decade. Measuring rods, a plumb line, a level that had belonged to her father's father, and that she had never once used to produce an inaccurate reading. These were not objects of sentiment. They were the precise instruments that this specific work required. The sandstone was everything the initial assessment had promised: fine-grained, consistent in density through the first 6 feet of depth, soft enough for chisel work, but hard enough to bear significant compressive load without behavior that would require monitoring. It had been formed when this region was the floor of a shallow inland sea, compressed over geological time into material that would, left alone, outlast every human ambition currently being pursued in the valley below. She began with the main room, 4 meters wide, 4.5 deep, carved into the cliff face, with the overhang serving as the natural ceiling above the entrance. She worked in long, deliberate strokes, reading the grain the way her father had taught her, following the stone's own logic rather than imposing hers on it. Where the rock wanted to cleave along a particular line, she let it cleave. Where it resisted, she accepted the resistance and moved around it, because stone that resists a tool at one angle will often cooperate at another, and fighting that cooperation was the mistake of beginners and the sin of impatient men. Elliot mixed mortar. He hauled materials up the ledge path on a small roan gelding they had acquired in Denver, a steady-tempered animal named Copper, who approached the ascending path with the equanimity of a creature that had decided trust was more efficient than anxiety. Window frames of milled pine came up in sections. Glass panes came up wrapped in horse blankets, with Elliot walking directly behind Copper's hindquarters, one hand always positioned to catch anything that shifted. Iron hinges, anchor bolts, 200 feet of good hemp rope oil lamp fixtures. He kept notes. 20 years of teaching had made record-keeping instinctive, but this was something more deliberate than habit. He had begun to understand, watching Maren work, that what she was building was a body of knowledge that existed nowhere in any written form he had encountered in 2 decades of reading primary sources. The positioning of the main room to capture south-facing winter sun. The angle of the overhang that would deflect snow into the valley floor rather than allowing it to bank against the entrance. The thickness of the north wall, which was 8 inches greater than the south wall. Not for structural reasons, but for thermal ones, buffering against the temperature differential between the cliff's deep interior and the worst of a Colorado January. The placement of a small water seep, a spring filtering through a sandstone stratum 8 feet above the ledge level, directed via a carved channel into a basin inside the structure where it would remain liquid through any cold that the high country could deliver. One evening in July, sitting on the ledge while Maren cleaned her chisels, Elliot looked up from his notes. The valley below was golden with late light sound drifting up in fragments, a hammer, a shout, a door. "You're making decisions that most builders don't consider." Maren ran a whetstone along a chisel edge in one long stroke. "Most builders are building for now. I'm building for January." She examined the edge, ran her thumb along it. "There's a difference." He wrote that down. He would write down dozens of her observations over the following 14 months, preserving them with the precision of a naturalist cataloging specimens, because the knowledge was worth preserving regardless of who eventually made use of it. The sleeping room came next, carved further into the cliff at a slight angle to the main chamber, so that body heat from two people sleeping there would be retained within the stone rather than escaping through the entrance passage. A connecting section to the storage space and small stable took 3 weeks of careful work because a natural fracture in the sandstone, though convenient in its direction, had a weakness at its upper edge that Maren refused to trust with a ceiling load until it had been reinforced with mortared stone. She worked around it twice, mapped its extent by sound tapping with a hammer, and listening for the change in resonance that indicated void, and spent 4 days on reinforcement before she was willing to proceed. Total materials cost at completion $261, including the $4 land filing fee. Against the structure going up at the north end of Gunnison Street, this figure was less than a rounding error. Cornelius Hatch had come to Colorado in 1873 with the understanding that in a silver boom, the real money was not in the silver. He had grown up poor in eastern Ohio, the son of a man who worked in an iron foundry and died of lung disease at 52. And he had spent his 20s in the specific manner of men who have decided that poverty is not a circumstance, but a verdict they intend to appeal. He understood leverage, financial, social, informational, the way Maren understood stone as the fundamental organizing principle beneath the surface of everything. He had bought land parcels in Harrow Creek when they were worth almost nothing, subdivided them, financed the mill, the hotel, the general store. He had made himself through careful years of positioned investment into the single point through which most of Harrow Creek's economic activity had to pass. He was 50 years old in 1878, broad-shouldered with hands that had not done physical labor in 15 years, and a face that had learned to reveal exactly as much as he chose to reveal. What distinguished Hatch from simpler versions of the same archetype was that he had genuinely started from nothing. He knew what cold felt like from the inside. He knew what it was to be hungry in a house where the walls admitted wind. The difference between the man he had been and the man he had become was not philosophical, it was financial. And he had made that difference as absolute as he could manage, by ensuring that the evidence of the earlier version was not visible from the outside. Hatch Manor was his argument made architectural. 3 stories of Douglas fir shipped from Oregon, 22 glass panes ordered from Denver, a tin roof, a full second-floor porch running the width of the facade. Projected cost $9,200 a figure Hatch had not kept private, because privacy about numbers of that magnitude would have defeated the point. The point was visibility. The point was that anyone standing anywhere on Gunnison Street would look north and understand without requiring additional information that the man who lived in that house had won. When one of his associates mentioned on a Tuesday evening in October of 1878 that a woman from Baltimore had purchased a cliff section for $4 with the stated intention of carving a house into the rock, Hatch listened with the slight forward lean that indicated genuine attention before leaning back and picking up his glass. He described the project with a word that encapsulated its apparent absurdity efficiently, a single dismissive syllable that moved around Gunnison Street by morning and reached every saloon by nightfall, acquiring embellishment at each stop. The following morning he sent his clerk to the land office with an offer of $50 for Maren's section. Generous. More than 12 times what she had paid before she had driven a single chisel into the rock. The clerk returned 2 hours later with the offer unmodified, uncontested, simply declined. Maren had thanked him for his time, turned back to whatever she had been doing on the cliff face before he arrived, and did not look up again. Hatch sat with this information for longer than the situation seemed to warrant. In 25 years of purchasing and selling things across 3 states, he had not often encountered a flat refusal to a reasonable offer from someone who had paid $4 for what he was offering $50. It was not the money. It was the category of the refusal. She had not countered. She had not asked for more. She had simply declined and returned to her work as though the offer had been a minor interruption of no particular significance. One winter, he said to his associates that evening, sitting at the table of his half-framed dining room with September air moving through the unglazed window openings, "Give them 1 winter up there in whatever they're building, and they'll be looking for a warm room to rent on Gunnison Street." The men assembled agreed. The conversation moved on. Outside, barely visible through the open framing against the south cliff face, nothing showed. Only shadow below the overhang, the path invisible at this distance, the place where Maren Wren had already been working for 4 months, appearing from the valley floor as just another stripe of darkness in the rock. Friedrich Baum's letter arrived in November of 1879, 3 months after Lodgestone Shelf was completed, and the Wren Vances had moved into rooms that the sandstone had been storing heat since June. The letter had been sent first to their Baltimore address, forwarded by a neighbor, and bore postmarks from 3 different post offices across its journey. Baum wrote from the territory of New Mexico, where he was conducting a geological survey of canyon formations near the Animas River. His handwriting was precise, his English formal in the way of a man who had learned it from books rather than from speech. He had found 12 more cliff dwellings, he wrote, all of them oriented to the south, all of them built under natural overhangs that shed precipitation away from the entrance, all of them still standing in conditions ranging from excellent to near perfect, while the wooden structures built by Anglo settlers in the same valleys over the past 30 years had already required significant repair or had been abandoned. He had taken measurements of interior winter temperatures in 3 of the intact structures and found them consistently between 45 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit during December without any artificial heating source. He closed with a sentence that Maren read twice, then a third time. "I cannot stop thinking about what you are doing in Colorado. I believe you understand something that we are only beginning to have the instruments to measure." Elliot watched her read the letter from across the room and waited until she set it on the table. "What does he say?" "That we're not inventing anything." She looked at the south window, which was showing the last pale light of a November afternoon over the valley below. "We're remembering something." He came to read the letter himself. When he finished, he looked at her with an expression she recognized, the one that meant he was already organizing information into a structure, thinking about sequence and argument. "I want to write to him." "Write to him," she said. "Tell him about the spring seep, the thermal measurements from last January, the amount of fuel we burned compared to what every cabin on Gunnison Street was burning." She picked up the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in the tin box where she kept her most important documents. Tell him to keep measuring. What she did not know then, what she would learn only years later from James Coldwell himself, was that Baum's letter had not arrived by chance. Coldwell had been watching Lodgestone Shelf take shape from his rough North Cliff shelter for 18 months, writing to Baum across that entire period, describing what he observed with the precision of a man who had been trying to understand the same problem for 2 decades and had finally found someone doing it correctly. It was Coldwell who had given Baum the Harrow Creek address. The letter was not coincidence. It was reconnaissance conducted by a man who lacked Maren's skill, but not her conviction, who had spent 22 years believing in the principle without being able to execute it, and who had decided that if he could not build the thing himself, he could at least make sure the person who could was not working in isolation. Silas Brody was 68 years old in the autumn of 1880 and had lived in the Harrow Creek drainage since 1852, when he had come as a young hunter and scout, following the mountain route that the Utes had been traveling for centuries before anyone thought to call it a trail. He was lean and weathered in the way of a man whose body had been shaped entirely by outdoor work, with hands that were disproportionately large and a stillness about him that most people mistook for slowness. He was not slow. He was simply economical. A man who had learned over decades of reading landscape and weather that unnecessary movement was a form of noise that interfered with observation. He had lived through the winter of 1847. He had been 15 that year, traveling with his father's trapping party of 16 men through a valley 80 miles north of Harrow Creek when the storm came. Not a storm as people meant when they used the word in ordinary conversation, not heavy snowfall or severe cold as individual phenomena, but both simultaneously at a scale and duration that none of the experienced men in the party had encountered or believed possible. The party had sheltered in 3 rough cabins built of green timber the previous autumn. Within 4 days, the weight on the roofs had exceeded what the construction could bear. Within 9 days, 14 of the 16 men were dead. Silas and his father had survived in a natural rock alcove on the valley's east face, a space barely large enough for 2 men lying flat, cold as iron, dark as a sealed room, but sheltered from wind and load. The rock above them held. The rock around them maintained the temperature at a level that permitted survival. When the storm broke, they walked out over a valley floor buried under 11 feet of compacted snow, past the collapsed remnants of 3 cabins that had been occupied by men his father had known for 20 years. Brody had not spoken of this publicly in Harrow Creek. Nobody in Harrow Creek had asked the right question, which was not, "Have you seen bad winters?" but, "Have you survived something that most people didn't?" He had watched the valley for 28 years, with the particular patience of a man who knows what he knows, and has stopped expecting others to ask about it. On an afternoon in early October 1880, he was sitting on the bench outside the general store with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the western peaks. What he saw was not any single alarming thing. It was an accumulation. The elk had descended from the high meadows, 2 weeks ahead of their usual schedule, moving in larger groups than normal, with a purposefulness that spoke of something more than a seasonal cold snap. The squirrels had been working the pine stands with an intensity he could only describe as anxious. The snow line on the western peaks had dropped faster than in any of the previous 4 autumns. The afternoons held a specific quality of stillness that he associated without being able to explain the association in terms that would satisfy a skeptic with the winters that did not behave. "This one's going to be different." He said it to the storekeeper who was standing in the doorway. "I've been in this drainage 28 years. I know what the regular winters feel like coming in. This doesn't feel regular." Cornelius Hatch was passing the store entrance at that moment, returning from the bank with his associate. He heard Brody's words through the open door, paused, applied the expression of a man who had learned to discount certain categories of information, and continued walking. "Old Brody sees catastrophe in everything," his voice carrying back to the doorway. "Last year he predicted catastrophe and we had the mildest January in a decade." Inside the store, Maren stood at the counter waiting for her order to be totaled. She heard every word Brody's assessment through the open door, Hatch's dismissal from the street. She paid for her order. Then she asked for 2 additional 50-pound sacks of flour to be added to it to be set aside until morning, when she would bring the larger pack frame down from the ledge. That evening she made a quiet inventory of everything in Lodgestone Shelf's storage passage. Then she made a second inventory of what she believed might actually be necessary. The gap between the 2 numbers sat in her chest all evening with a particular weight, not panic, which was not a state she was familiar with, but a kind of cold arithmetic that demanded action without offering the comfort of certainty. On the 3rd day of October, she spent 6 hours driving iron rings into the sandstone along the full length of the outer ledge. 8 rings spaced at intervals she had calculated based on the rope work she anticipated, each one set at a precise angle, not straight into the rock but angled downward at 12 degrees, which would allow a loaded rope to bear against the anchor without working the ring loose through repeated stress cycles. She tested each ring before moving to the next, applying her full body weight in the direction that maximum load would pull, listening for any sound from the stone that indicated movement. Elliot came back from a supply run to find her testing the final ring with both hands, leaning her full weight against it. He looked at the 8 rings spaced along the ledge. "What are those for?" "Anchor points, for rope work." He studied the spacing, the angle, the depth she had driven them. He was a man who had spent 20 years studying how things were built and why they failed, and he understood what anchor points rated for body weight were intended to hold. Rope work for what specifically? She released the ring and stood. Her expression held something he recognized as the face she wore when the answer to a question was too large to say quickly, and she had already thought through every branch of it. "Things I'd rather not need them for." She went inside. Elliot stood on the ledge for a moment longer, looking at the 8 iron rings, and then at the valley below where the lights of Harrow Creek were beginning to come on in the early dusk, warm and confident in their timber frame buildings. He went inside and wrote in his journal, "She installed 8 anchor points today and wouldn't explain beyond rope work. I have been with her long enough to know that when she prepares for something she won't name, I should trust the preparation. She has always looked further ahead than I have. This is one of the things I most depend on in her, though I have rarely said so." 3 days later, Silas Brody came up the ledge path in the late morning without announcement and sat down on the stone bench Elliot had carved into the outer wall the previous spring. He sat for 15 minutes without speaking while Maren worked on the secondary water basin she had been planning since August. He looked at the iron rings. He looked at the 6 coils of rope she had stacked near the entrance. He looked at the valley below and then at the western peaks where the snow line sat lower than it had any right to in early October. 1847, he said at last, not to her exactly, but not to the air either. Maren set down her chisel. She had not heard the story. Nobody in Harrow Creek had heard the story. But she looked at his hands and at his eyes and at the particular quality of stillness in him that was different from ordinary calm, and she understood what she was looking at. How many survived? 2. She picked up her chisel. I have enough room for 14 people up here, possibly more if we use the storage passage for sleeping. Brody looked at the ledge, its carved rooms, its south-facing window, the overhang clean above the entrance. He looked at the valley below where Hatch Manor was rising at the north end of Gunnison Street, its third story now framed, its windows gleaming in the October light. He stood up. Wood goes, he said. Stone stays. He walked back down the path without further ceremony. Maren heard his boots on the stone steps steady and unhurried until the sound merged with the wind coming off the peaks. That evening, she rolled 2 barrels of salt pork into the deepest section of the storage passage. She checked the knots on each of the 6 rope coils stacked by the entrance. She stood at the south window and looked at the valley below Gunnison Street, the lights, the smoke rising from 20 chimneys in the early dark, and she made no dramatic internal speech about what was coming. Drama was for people who had not yet done the calculations. She had done the calculations. What remained was the work. Elliot came to stand beside her. He had been watching her movements all day with the expression of a man assembling evidence, and he had arrived at a conclusion he was not sure he wanted to state. "You're not preparing for a bad winter," he said carefully. "You're preparing for something that has a specific number of days." She looked at him. He had not asked a question. He had made an observation that was accurate. 12, she said. "If I'm reading the formation correctly, give or take 2 days on either side." She turned from the window. "I could be wrong." He thought about this for a moment. In 20 years of studying catastrophic failures, military, architectural, civic, he had learned that the people who said, "I could be wrong" before a crisis were more reliable than the ones who said, "I could be wrong" after one. "What do we need?" She handed him the list she had been writing for 3 days. He read it in the lamplight, his face doing the things it did when he was absorbing information and simultaneously organizing it into categories. He set the list on the table, smoothed it flat with one hand, and looked at his wife. "We'll need copper to make 2 trips tomorrow." 3, she said. "I measured the flour wrong." Outside, the peaks caught the last light orange first, then red, then the deep cold purple that meant the temperature had already begun its evening drop toward something serious. Below, Harrow Creek glittered with ordinary life, saloon music, chimney smoke, the sound of men at the end of a working day who believed reasonably that everything they had built would still be standing in April. The rope coils sat by the door. The iron rings waited in the stone. The cliff held its heat from a summer not yet finished, storing it patient in the way that only very old material can be patient, without hope, without fear, without any investment in the outcome at all. Simply there, simply warm, simply waiting for whatever came next to require it. The wind arrived before the snow on the morning of March 2nd, 1881, which told Maren something that ordinary storms did not. In her experience of mountain weather precipitation, lead wind followed, amplifying what had already fallen, driving it sideways, packing it into spaces it would not otherwise reach. Wind arriving first meant the system had organized itself over distance, gathered coherence before it arrived, sent its advance pressure through the valley like a structural test before the main load appeared. She was already awake when it began. She lay still for a moment in the dark of the sleeping room with her left palm flat against the wall beside the bed, feeling through her skin what her ears were assembling. The stone was warm, that deep, patient warmth the cliff had been storing since the previous summer, releasing it so gradually that you noticed it only when you pressed your skin directly against the surface. Outside, the wind moved through the valley in a register she had not heard from this ledge before. Not the usual high shriek off the peaks, but something lower, more sustained, a sound that had weight to it. She dressed without lighting the lamp, moving through the familiar geometry of the sleeping room by touch, then went to the main room's south window. The valley below was dark. First gray light was beginning at the eastern peaks, but Harrow Creek was still a scatter of orange lamp glow from uncurtained windows. She watched the smoke from the nearest chimney below. It was bending not straight across, but spiraling, caught in the compression between the cliff walls, doubling back on itself. That was the valley's geometry working against its resident storms that would have been merely severe in open country became something different here. Contained. The energy bouncing between the stone walls intensifying, finding nowhere to go but down. Snow began at 4:47 in the morning. She noted the time because her father had taught her that knowing when something started told you things about its nature that the event itself sometimes concealed. Snow beginning before sunrise in early March in Colorado at this elevation could mean anything. Snow beginning with this specific wind after Silas Brody had looked at the western peaks and said what he said after 40 years of Brody's accumulated reading of this particular landscape, this snow meant something specific. Brody was already awake. She found him at the entrance to his alcove at the east end of the ledge, standing with his arms at his sides, watching the snowfall begin over the valley. He did not turn when she came to stand beside him. They watched together for a few minutes. The flakes were fine and dense, the kind that accumulated faster than their individual size suggested, because they packed without significant air between them. How long? Her voice was quiet in the pre-dawn cold. Brody's jaw worked slightly the way it did when he was measuring something against internal evidence that had no precise language. Longer than any of them down there have prepared for. She went inside to start the fire. By mid-morning, the accumulation on the valley floor was already 8 inches. Gunnison Street had emptied of foot traffic. The sound of the wind through the valley walls had become continuous, not gusting, not intermittent, but sustained a pressure rather than an event. Copper stood in the stone stable with his ears back. Weight shifted subtly toward the rear wall, putting as much rock between himself and the noise as the space permitted. Agnes Finley, who had come up the ledge path 2 days before the storm at Maren's direct request, not quite an invitation, more an accurate prediction that her medical kit would be needed, was organizing the storage passage with the systematic focus of someone converting a supply room into a treatment facility before the need became urgent. Elliot came to stand beside Maren at the south window with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one over without speaking. They watched the morning progress from bad to something more deliberate, not the violence of a sudden storm, but the settled, unhurried accumulation of one that had decided to stay. By early afternoon, the far cliff wall was beginning to blur. By nightfall, the drifts against the north-facing walls of Harrow Creek's buildings had reached window level on the first floors. The snow itself was not yet the primary problem. The wind was the problem, its capacity to compress what fell into something denser than loose accumulation, filling gaps under eaves, banking against doors, beginning the slow transfer of weight onto roof structures that had been built with no expectation of bearing it. Lodgestone Shelf collected nothing at the entrance. The overhang executed its function without drama, deflecting accumulation outward so that it fell several feet in front of the doorway rather than against it. The south-facing window held a clear view of the valley, even as everything below disappeared into white opacity. The stone walls did not flex, did not groan, did not register the storm as anything requiring acknowledgement. Day 3 brought the first crisis below. Maren was watching the valley in the gray morning light when the smoke from Hatch Manor changed. Not the chimney smoke she had been monitoring since the storm's first hours, reading it, the way a physician reads a patient's breathing looking for information rather than reassurance, but a sudden cessation from the main flue. The stack on the building's north face went from a steady gray column to nothing. Then minutes later, thin wisps appeared from wrong places, the joints between second-floor wall planks, the gap beneath a north window, the unmistakable signature of smoke finding routes it had never been intended to travel. She understood the mechanism immediately. The wind driving down the northwest face at that specific angle had created a downdraft in the chimney column strong enough to reverse the draw. The fire in Hatch Manor was still burning. Its smoke now had nowhere to go but inward. She called Elliot to the window. He stood beside her for a moment, taking in what she was seeing. The misplaced smoke, the absence from the main flue, the implication of what was happening in the floors below. How many other buildings will have that problem? His voice had the flatness of a man keeping it controlled by conscious effort. Everyone whose chimney opening is exposed to the northwest, everyone who built facing the wrong direction. She turned from the window. Most of them. She moved to the storage passage without running, not from composure performing itself, but because running served nothing. She checked the rope coils, checked the 8 anchor rings along the outer ledge, checked the 4 shovels stacked with their handles accessible. She counted the blankets. She ran the food inventory against a new arithmetic that had not been relevant 3 days ago. When she came back to the main room, Elliot was still at the window. He turned his face, holding something she rarely saw in him. Not anger, but the place in a person where helplessness converts to urgency, because helplessness is intolerable. There are children in those buildings, Maren. I know exactly what is down there. Her voice did not harden. It simply held its ground. If we go down in this storm, we die within 50 feet of the cliff base. We cannot help anyone from the bottom of a snowdrift. He stood very still. The wind pushed against the south window, not threatening it. The frame was set too deep for that, but audible, a constant physical reminder of what was happening in the valley below. When the storm breaks, we go down with clear sight, clear footing, with everything we have prepared. She held his gaze. Those are the 2 choices available. There is no version where going now produces a better outcome. He sat down. He put his hands flat on his knees and looked at the stone floor between his feet. After a long time, how long until it breaks? 2 days, possibly 3. He did not open his journal. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the floor and did the same thing Maren was doing, which was bearing the weight of a correct decision that felt nothing like the right one. She wrote the calculation on paper the morning of day 4. The load estimate for Hatch Manor's north wall, the timeline for structural failure under sustained accumulation at the current rate, the survivable void that would remain in the southwest kitchen corner if the collapse proceeded as the geometry suggested it would. She folded the paper, tied it to a length of rope, and lowered it from the ledge into the valley below, letting it hang at window level for a building that faced the right direction to see it. Nobody in Harrow Creek was moving. The street was already under 4 feet of packed snow. The paper hung there for 2 hours before the wind tore it away. That night, Maren could not sleep. She sat in the chair closest to the hearth with her father's oldest chisel in her hands, not working, simply holding it. The handle had been worn to the shape of her family's hands across 2 generations, the wood smooth in a way that no finish produced, only decades of grip. Outside, the wind continued its sustained note over the valley walls, and somewhere below in the dark, in buildings that had been built to be seen rather than to hold people, were making their own calculations about how much longer they could sustain what they had. On the morning of day 6, before first light, Maren woke to find the ledge missing one of its occupants. Brody's alcove was empty. One of the 6 rope coils was gone from its position near the anchor rings. The nearest ring showed fresh abrasion on its iron surface, the mark of a rope pulled under load in the dark hours. She went to the ledge's edge. The rope was there, descending into the storm-dark valley below, taut. Someone was on it, or had been on it recently, or had reached the bottom and was maintaining tension for a reason she could not yet read. She tested the rope's movement, irregular, deliberate, not the movement of a rope blowing in wind, but the movement of a rope being used by a person who knew how to move along one in darkness and cold. She did not wake Elliot. She went inside, put on every layer she owned, came back to the ledge and waited. 2 hours later, the rope moved in a pattern she recognized, 3 distinct pulses evenly spaced. She called for Elliot then. Together they took the rope's tension and began the steady, controlled process of bearing whatever was ascending. What came over the ledge edge first was Brody's arm, then his shoulder. He was moving slowly, not from injury, but from the weight of what he was carrying against his chest. A child, perhaps 2 years old, wrapped in his outer coat, the child's face pressed into the hollow of his neck. The child was alive. Cold, not hypothermic crying, with the suppressed, exhausted cry of a small person who had been frightened for too long in too small a space. Brody sat down on the ledgestone and let Agnes Findlay take the child from his arms. His hands were the color of old paper at the fingertips. He did not speak for several minutes. Agnes worked over the child in efficient silence, assessing, warming the professional calm of a woman who saves her alarm for things that actually warrant it. Maren crouched in front of Brody. His eyes were open, tracking clear. She took both his hands in hers and looked at the fingertip color. Superficial. He would keep all his fingers. Which building? Harwick family, east end of Gunnison, south side. His voice was rough from cold air. There was a child crying. I could hear it from the base of the cliff. I found the window. He looked at the child in Agnes's arms. The mother wouldn't let me take the baby at first. I had to convince her the rope would hold. A pause. I didn't ask you because you would have said no. Maren held his hands for another moment, checking circulation, checking color. Then she looked directly at him. I would have said no. I know. He met her eyes without apology. That's why I didn't ask. She stood. Inside her, the calculation was running. What he had done was exactly the kind of decision that made emergencies worse. A 68-year-old man alone in a storm at night without a spotter descending a rope to a buried building. It was also the reason a child was alive on this ledge instead of in the building below. These two things were both true simultaneously, and she had lived long enough to understand that the situations producing simultaneous, irreconcilable truths were the ones that defined a person's actual values as opposed to their stated ones. She said nothing further about it. She went inside to help Agnes with the child. On the night of day 7, at an hour when the valley held only the diminished lamp glow of whatever heat sources were still functioning below, the sound came. She was in the chair with the chisel when it arrived, not sharp like breaking ice, but massive, the kind of sound that required a full second to finish because the object making it was very large. Then a sustained cascade, the layered percussion of heavy timber failing under load each level, driving the one below it, a sequence that ended in a compression of sound so dense it passed through Lodgestone Shelf stone walls as vibration rather than noise. The building that had been designed to be visible from every point on Gunnison Street was announcing its end in the only register left available to it. She was at the window before the echo finished. In the dark valley below, the distributed glow of whatever remained of Harrow Creek had a gap in it, a section of the light pattern simply absent where it had been present for 3 years. She did not need to calculate which building. She had been calculating the load on Hatch Manor's north wall since day 3. Elliot appeared from the sleeping room. He came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They watched the storm continue moving over the place where the sound had originated, covering it indifferent. People are dying down there. His voice had moved past urgency into something quieter, grief without its performance. Some of them. She pressed her palm flat against the south window frame, feeling the cliff's warmth conducted through the wood. Not all of them. The southwest kitchen corner of that building is still standing. The geometry of the collapse would have left a void. She had been running this calculation since the sound stopped. If he understood to shelter in the lowest interior corner when the north wall gave, and he is not a man without intelligence, there is a survivable space. Elliot looked at her in the dark of the room. You tried to warn him. I tried to give him information, whether he would have acted on it. She did not finish this. The unfinished sentence was its own answer. On day 5 toward evening, Brody had come to stand beside her at the window. He had been more interior than his ordinary stillness since the storm's second day, as though spending whatever small reserve of language he kept on the memory of 1847 rather than the present. He stood at her shoulder for a moment. Then, the 1847 storm broke on day 9, but the cold after it was worse than the storm itself. The men who went out too soon on day 10 lasted less than an hour. Maren had not turned from the window. I know you know. He had gone back to his alcove. She carried those words with her through days 8 and 9 as the temperature dropped further and the snowfall which had been easing became almost irrelevant. What mattered was what the cold was doing to everything already on the ground, compressing it, crystallizing it, converting layers of snow into something that had more in common with packed earth than with precipitation. On day 9, she stepped onto the snowpack surface at the overhang's edge, full weight both feet. Her boots did not sink. The surface was exactly what she had calculated it would become. When the temperature dropped below a certain threshold, load-bearing, navigable, as firm as the valley floor itself. She came inside, told Elliot. He set down his pen. We go. Not yet. The thermometer mounted inside the overhang read -21 Fahrenheit. At this temperature, frostbite begins in under 15 minutes on exposed skin. We open a building, pull people out into open air at -20, and we complete what the storm started. She looked at the thermometer. When this reads above -10 consistently, we go, regardless of what the sky is doing. He picked his pen up and put it down again. He had been doing this for 3 days, a gesture that had become his way of registering the unbearable patience required by a situation he could not act on yet. On the afternoon of day 10, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, the smoke column from the east end of the valley, a thin thread that had been rising since approximately day 6. The only evidence besides Lodgestone Shelf itself that something still burned in Harrow Creek thickened briefly, then stopped. Not diminished. Stopped completely. Maren watched for 20 minutes. The column did not resume. Agnes Finley was behind her when she turned. The doctor's face held the specific expression of a woman who had been counting probabilities since the column first appeared on day 6. If he's still alive, he has 12 hours. Perhaps fewer. She did not specify who she meant. Everyone on the ledge who had been watching that thin smoke thread knew who she meant. Maren looked at the thermometer. -17. Still dangerous. Still above the threshold she had set. She sat with this for 30 seconds, which was as long as she permitted herself. Then she looked at Agnes. Rope. Blankets. Agnes was already moving. The descent was controlled, methodical, executed in the manner of someone for whom urgency was not the same thing as haste. The distinction being that haste introduced errors, while urgency simply compressed the time available to avoid them. Maren descended the south cliff face alone. She had not permitted Elliot to accompany her for reasons she stated precisely. He had no experience on a rope over iced sandstone, and a second person without that experience in those conditions was not assistance, but an additional emergency waiting to occur. She reached the snowpack surface in 38 seconds and stepped off the rope onto ground as solid as stone. The surface caught the early afternoon light at an angle that was nearly blinding. She filed this away as an oversight in her preparation that would require addressing before the post-storm rescue operations when the same surface would produce the same problem at greater scale. She crossed the valley floor in the direction of the north cliff face, moving steadily, testing load distribution through her boot soles. The distance was perhaps 300 yards. She covered it in silence and cold that pressed against every exposed surface of her face with the serious intention of a climate that was not finished with this valley yet. The north cliff shelter was not visible until she was within 20 feet of it, a shallow excavation in the rock face partially concealed by the snowdrift that had formed against the cliff's base. The entrance had been blocked by drifting during the storm's last major accumulation period. She dug it clear with the short shovel she had carried, working with the economy of someone managing a fixed energy budget in dangerous cold. Inside, James Coldwell unconscious, breathing in the shallow pattern of a man whose core temperature had dropped past the point where his body could generate meaningful heat. Not yet irreversible, not yet. The space he had excavated over 22 years of intermittent work on the north cliff was crude compared to Lodgestone Shelf, a single room, barely large enough for a man to lie flat with no water source, no proper ventilation system. The entrance positioned in a way that invited drift accumulation. He had survived in it through 6 winters on the strength of its basic thermal advantage over any timber frame structure in the valley below the rock-held heat. Not as efficiently as the south-facing alcove she had chosen, not with any of the refinements she had spent 14 months adding, but enough. The rock held heat because rock always holds heat regardless of whether the person inside it understands why. She could not carry him across 300 yards of snowpack alone. She had known this before she descended. What she could do was what she had brought materials for. She wrapped him in the 2 blankets, elevated his head slightly, then with the short chisel she had also carried, because she was Maren Wren, and she did not go to a stone surface without a chisel. She cut a ventilation opening in the upper section of the shelter's east wall, 8 inches wide by 4 inches high, angled to prevent drift accumulation while allowing air exchange. The work took 91 minutes. By the time she finished, her fingers had progressed from cold to the specific numbness that precedes tissue damage. She noted this, completed the ventilation cut, verified the angle, packed her tools, left half the emergency rations she had carried. Coldwell's breathing had deepened slightly during the work, the increased air exchange doing what she had intended it to do. She returned across the valley floor and ascended the rope. Elliot was at the ledge edge when she came over it, his face carrying the expression she recognized as the aftermath of sustained fear that has been held in check by the knowledge that expressing it would accomplish nothing useful. Agnes examined Maren's right hand before she examined anything else. 2 fingertips right hand had progressed into the early tissue change that indicated frostbite beyond the superficial stage. Agnes said what she said without softening it. You have perhaps 1 more operation in those fingers before you do permanent damage. Choose it carefully. Maren looked at her hand with the same expression she used when examining a structural problem, assessing calculating implications, filing the information where it would inform future decisions. Understood. I need you to mean that. I mean it. Agnes wrapped the fingers without further discussion. Maren spent the rest of the day at the window, managing the inventory of her right hand's capability against the operations she had not yet completed. Day 11. The thermometer read -14 at dawn, -11 by mid-afternoon. The snowpack surface had dropped another inch, the March sun doing its first real work of the season on a surface that was no longer receiving new accumulation. Elliot was awake when she checked the thermometer at 8 in the evening, -9. She looked at the instrument for a long time. Then she looked at Elliot, who was looking at her from across the room with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific number. Tomorrow. She set the thermometer down. Whatever it reads at first light, we go. He closed his journal. He had been writing something in the final pages that she had not read and would not read until after a historian's account of what it had meant to spend 12 days in a stone room while the world below it either survived or did not. He closed it with the particular finality of a man setting down the record because the record was now complete. She went to the rope coils. She checked each knot at both ends, ran the length of each through her hands, assessed condition, lay them in order near the anchor rings. She checked the shovels. She laid out the blankets in stacks of 3 organized for rapid distribution. She prepared the food parcels she had been assembling for 2 days, compact, calorie-dense, the right amounts for a person emerging from extended cold who needed to be warmed from the inside before being moved. Outside, the peaks had cleared. The stars of the Colorado high country burned in the specific way they burned after a storm system passed, hard, cold, very bright, as though the atmosphere had been scoured of everything that ordinarily softened their light. She stood at the ledge's edge and looked at what the valley had become, 7 feet of snow over everything. The shape of a town preserved in it like an object pressed into plaster. The contours of a community she had lived beside for 3 years rendered in white geometry below her. Brody came to stand beside her. His hands were wrapped, 2 fingers bandaged where Agnes had addressed the frostbite damage, but his posture was unchanged from any other night he had stood on this ledge. 1847 ended on a night exactly like this, he told her. Stars like that. No wind at all. My father said the silence was what woke him. After 9 days of wind, the quiet was louder than the storm. She remained at the ledge edge for another 10 minutes, running through every calculation she had made in the preceding 11 days, checking each one against what she now knew, identifying the errors, filing the corrections. Then she went inside, lay down on the sleeping room floor, pressed her back against the warm stone of the wall, and did not sleep so much as enter a state of suspension. Her mind quiet at last, the calculations complete, everything in place for what came next. At 3:40 in this morning, the wind stopped. The silence it left behind was absolute. Not the muffled silence of heavy snowfall, but the clear, crystalline silence of a sky with nothing left in it. Maren was awake in the same moment the wind ceased, as though the absence of sound was a physical event that required a response. She lay still for exactly 1 minute, confirming what she was hearing. Then she rose, dressed, went to the thermometer. -6 Fahrenheit. Above the threshold she had set. Above it by 4 degrees. She went to Elliot's journal on the table, opened it to the first blank page, wrote the date at the top, March 14th, 1881, and left it open in the lamplight. Then she took the first rope coil from its position near the entrance, walked to the nearest anchor ring, made the connection through the coil over the ledge edge, and watched it unroll down the cliff face into the pre-dawn dark below. She went over the edge. The descent was methodical, her boots finding the irregularities in the cliff surface that she had memorized over 3 years of looking at this rock from above. 41 seconds to the snowpack. She stepped off the rope onto a surface as firm as packed clay, the cold pressing against her face, with the serious intention of a climate that was not finished with this valley yet. She took 3 steps away from the cliff base, testing density through her boot soles, then looked back up at the ledge where the lamp still burned behind the south window. Elliot's boots appeared over the edge 30 seconds later. He reached the surface, stepped off the rope, exhaled a cloud of vapor that dissipated immediately in the cold. He looked at the valley, the flat, featureless white expanse where a town had been, with an expression that had no predecessor in the catalog of expressions she had seen on his face in 7 years of marriage. It was the face of a man confronting an absence where he had expected a world. James Coldwell was sitting on the snowpack outside his North Cliff shelter. He had worked himself out sometime during the night through the entrance she had cleared on day 10 and had been sitting in the dark with the 2 blankets around his shoulders waiting. When Maren moved toward the south cliff to begin the first excavation, he stood, stiffly carefully with the measured movements of a man whose body had registered every hour of 11 days in a cold stone room. He walked after her, taking the direct line across the valley floor. She heard him coming 10 seconds before she would have looked up and seen him. She knew the sound of him from 3 years of occasional presence, the specific weight distribution of a man who had spent decades in mountain terrain, cautious with his feet, in the particular way of someone who had survived by reading surfaces rather than trusting them. He came to stand beside her where she was beginning her first assessment of the snow surface above the section of Gunnison Street she intended to excavate first. He looked at the shovel in her hand. He looked at her right hand with its bandaged fingers. "You have a spare..." His voice was rough from 11 days of cold air and inadequate hydration, but fully functional. She looked at him for a moment, at his hands, which were in better condition than hers, at his face, which carried the look of a man who had spent 11 days making a private accounting of his own decisions. She reached into the pack she was carrying, pulled out the second shovel, held it toward him. He took it without ceremony. She turned to the snow surface, planted her shovel, began the probe that would locate the roofline of the first building. Behind her, she heard Elliot cross to join them. 3 people, 3 shovels, 11 days of snow between them and whatever was still alive below it. She drove the probe down until it struck wood, located the roofline edge, moved laterally to find the exterior wall, began the mathematics of excavation, calculating angle, depth, structural load, the position of the entrance relative to the building's orientation, which she had memorized because she had made it her business over 3 years to know where every door on Gunnison Street faced. Elliot dug beside her without requiring instruction. Coldwell dug on her other side with the focused economy of a man who had been waiting a long time to do something useful. The sound of their shovels in the compacted snow carried out across the valley in the early morning quiet, steady, rhythmic, the sound of people working. Below them, somewhere in the dark and the cold, people were waiting for that sound. 19 people died in the storm of March 1881. That number did not become abstract with time. It did not soften into statistic. It remained 19 specific people: the Caldwell family from the north end of Gunnison Street, the 2 brothers who ran the assay office annex, the woman who had operated the laundry service from a building that faced northwest and whose roof had given way on day 4 before anyone understood what was happening. Maren knew each name by the end of the first week of rescue operations, cataloged them the way she cataloged structural failures, not to assign blame, but because knowing the specific point of failure was the only way to prevent the next one. The rescue took 4 days after the storm broke. James Coldwell had been the first person she found on the valley surface that morning, sitting on the iron-hard snowpack outside his North Cliff shelter with the matter-of-fact posture of a man who had already decided the worst was behind him. He took the spare shovel without ceremony. The absence of thanks between them was not rudeness, but something more useful, the recognition between 2 people who had each survived by their own means that gratitude belonged to a different register than the work now required. The Harwick family came out of the ground on day 1, Martin, his wife Catherine, their daughters, the infant. Thomas Harwick was 17 with the stored energy of a young man who had spent 12 days in a shrinking space, and he channeled that energy directly into the excavation work with a focus that Maren recognized as something more than youth. He did not need to be told twice about anything, which was the quality she valued most in a person holding a shovel over a buried building. Cornelius Hatch came out on day 4 from the southwest kitchen corner of what had been Hatch Manor, after 8 hours of the hardest excavation of the entire operation. His cheekbones were purple-gray with frostbite. His lips were cracked past the point of bleeding. When Maren reached into the space and her hand found his, he took it without the grab of desperation, deliberately, with the grip of a man accepting something he understood he had not earned. She pulled him forward. He could not stand at full height immediately. His legs had been folded too long, stiffened by 4 days of cold that had worked into the joints. She put his weight across her shoulders and walked him to the excavation opening where Theodore, his 17-year-old son, was waiting above with two other members of the surface team. At the base of the south cliff before the rope ascent, Hatch stopped. He turned and looked up at Lodgestone Shelf, the south window catching the afternoon light, the overhang clean above the entrance, the iron rings still holding their ropes against the sandstone face. He was quiet for a long time. His wife Eleanor was already being carried up by the team. His children had gone ahead. He stood alone at the base of the cliff with the ruins of his investment somewhere under 9 feet of compacted snow behind him, and the thing that had survived directly above him. And whatever was working its way through his mind in that moment did not produce speech for nearly 2 minutes. "I offered you $50 for this." His voice came out rougher than it had any right to be damaged by days of bad air. "I thought I was being generous." Maren was already checking the rope condition before trusting it with another load. She looked at him once directly without satisfaction, without the particular sharpness that vindication sometimes produces in people who have been proven right after being laughed at. Her expression was simply exact. "Save your strength for the climb. It's steeper than it looks." She turned back to the rope. The town meeting happened on the 1st of April, 1881, convened in the open air at the base of the south cliff because it was the only space large enough to hold everyone, and because the single intact building, the low stone assay office, which had survived by virtue of its small footprint and heavy timber framing, was serving as Agnes Finley's expanded treatment space. 49 survivors stood in the cold. Their breath made clouds in the April air. The snowpack had dropped 2 feet in the preceding week, enough to expose the upper sections of some false front facades, painted letters advertising services that no longer had buildings attached to them. Hatch spoke first. He walked to the center of the group without being invited and faced them with the directness of a man who had made a private decision about performance that its cost now exceeded anything he stood to gain from it. He described what he had built, what it had cost, what he had believed it represented. He did not move through these facts quickly. He stayed with each one long enough for it to carry full weight. "Then, I was wrong about what money could guarantee. I want you to understand that I understand it not as a formality, because some of what happened in those 12 days is on the decisions I made, and some of the 19 names we're carrying are heavier for that." The silence that followed was not forgiveness withheld. It was the silence of people too genuinely altered to perform any response they did not actually feel. Catherine Harwick, standing near the back with her infant against her chest, spoke into that silence with the directness of a woman who had spent 12 days deciding what mattered. "What do we do now?" Maren moved from the edge of the group toward its center, not to the exact center which she left open as a space belonging to no single person, but close enough to be heard without raising her voice. "We don't have to rebuild the same town. Nothing requires us to put the same buildings back in the same positions because they occupied those positions before. The valley floor is a difficult place to build in this climate. We know that now with a certainty we didn't have 3 years ago." She let this settle before continuing. "The south cliff face, you know what it can hold. The north face has formations that work differently. Less winter sun, but protection from the spring flooding that comes down the east drainage every melt season. There are positions on both faces that could shelter families through any winter this valley is capable of producing within a building season." A man near the front, one of the miner's arms still carrying the particular tiredness of someone who had been digging for 4 days, asked the question that was in most minds, "You'd have us all living in cliff holes." Maren looked at him without impatience. "I'd have you living in places that are still standing in 1891. What they look like from the outside is a separate question from whether they work. You were inside Lodgestone Shelf for 11 days. You know what it felt like." Nobody disputed that. Thomas Harwick raised his hand. He was 17, standing among men twice his age, and he raised it with a directness that made several of them look at him, not with condescension, but with the involuntary attention that genuine clarity commands. "Will you teach us how to do what you did?" Maren looked at the boy for a moment. Then she looked at the broader group, all the faces that had 3 years ago carried various degrees of amusement at the woman who had purchased a cliff for $4. The amusement was gone. What had replaced it was not precisely humility. What she saw was something more structural, an orientation that had been forcibly reorganized. "The stone doesn't care whether you understood it last year," she told them. "It only cares what you do with it now. Reconstruction began in May 1881 and would occupy the next 3 years in ways that none of them had fully anticipated. The first surprise was how much slower teaching was than working. What Maren could accomplish alone in an hour took half a day when she was explaining each step to 3 people who had not previously held a chisel. She accepted this without visible frustration, because the frustration would have been a form of dishonesty. The teaching was the point, not a concession to it. One well-built structure could shelter 50 people in a crisis. A valley full of people who understood the principles could shelter everyone in every crisis that followed indefinitely without requiring Maren Wren to be present. Eliot organized his notes into a teaching sequence over the winter of 1881 into 1882. He had the historian's instinct for structure, the understanding that knowledge becomes transmissible only when it is organized around decisions rather than descriptions. He was rigorous about the distinction between what he had observed and what he had inferred, marking each clearly revising when Maren's practice in the field contradicted what he had written without him defending the earlier version. The notes were for students who would come after them, not for his own sense of completion. James Coldwell became the first unexpected student. He was 58 years old, had spent 22 years understanding something without being able to execute it, and he came to Maren in June of 1881, not with the posture of a beginner, but with the posture of a man who had been standing outside a room for 2 decades and was finally walking through the door. He already knew how to read a rock surface. What he lacked was technique, the precise angle, the reading of grain direction under load, the discipline to follow the stone's logic, rather than imposing his own preferred line. She taught him for 4 months. He was a difficult student in the best sense, questioning everything, not from resistance, but from genuine need to understand the reasoning behind each choice. When she told him to change his chisel angle by 8 degrees, he asked why 8 and not 10. She showed him, rather than explain, 2 cuts at different angles into a prepared block. Then she let him examine what each produced. He ran his finger along both cuts for a long time. After that, he never asked a question that could be answered by a demonstration. He went directly to the demonstration himself, then came to her only when what he observed raised something the demonstration couldn't resolve. One afternoon in the 4th month of his instruction, Coldwell set down his chisel and told her about the letters to Baum. He told it simply, without apology for the presumption of it, the way a man recounts something he believed was right when he did it and still believes was right now. He had written to Baum for 18 months describing what he watched taking shape on the South Cliff. He had given Baum the Harrow Creek address. The letter that arrived at Lodgestone Shelf in November of 1879 had not been coincidence. Maren listened without interrupting. When he finished, she picked up her own chisel and turned back to the wall. She worked 2 strokes in silence. Then, "You kept the idea alive while you were waiting." Coldwell looked at his hands. "It was the only thing I could do." "It was enough," she said. The words were not comfort. They were assessment. Cornelius Hatch's contribution began as money and became, over the course of 2 years, something he had not anticipated when he wrote the first check. He funded the community hall, a long, low chamber cut into the north cliff face at 30 feet elevation, accessible by carved stone steps that would remain navigable under any snow depth the valley could produce. He hired Eliot to design the interior organization, Maren to supervise the stonework himself as a general laborer. This surprised most of Harrow Creek. The surprise did not survive close observation. The man who had come out of the ground at the southwest corner of his ruined house was not performing labor as penance. He was doing something harder, developing an actual interest in doing the work correctly for its own sake, separate from what doing it correctly said about him. He broke a chisel handle in the first week. He gouged the work surface twice at angles that Maren corrected without comment. He asked Eliot to explain the reasoning behind each correction, then asked Maren to show him the physical consequence in the stone of what the wrong angle produced. He was not a natural. His hands were wrong for the grip in the way that some bodies are simply not configured for certain tools. But he was honest about this, which was more useful than aptitude without honesty. Theodore Hatch was a different matter entirely. The boy was 17, recently grown into a physical confidence that his father had never quite possessed despite his size, and he came to the construction site with the particular hunger of someone who has discovered that a thing they did not know they needed turns out to be exactly what they needed. Within the first week, Maren noticed how he held his hand flat against the rock face before striking, pressing his palm to the stone the way she pressed her palm to stone, reading the surface before committing to a cut. She had taught nobody to do this. He had arrived at it independently through some combination of observation and instinct that she recognized as the signal she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. She gave him harder problems earlier than she gave the other students, not as favoritism, but as precision. Pushing him to the edge of his current capability was the most efficient path to extending it. He worked with an intensity that occasionally required her to send him home in the evenings before he drove himself into the diminishing returns territory where tired hands made errors that fresh hands would not. "Stone is patient," she told him more than once. "You don't have to race it." He heard this advice the way young people who are genuinely good at something hear advice to slow down. He acknowledged it, integrated it to perhaps 80%, then proceeded. She did not push for the remaining 20. The 80% was significant progress. Silas Brody, who had taken up permanent residence in a small carved alcove at the east end of Lodgestone Shelf's ledge, an arrangement that had begun as temporary and calcified into permanent, through the simple mechanism of no one mentioning that it might be otherwise proved to be an unexpectedly precise observer of how Theodore worked. One morning in the summer of 1882, watching the boy from the stone bench, Brody turned to Maren. "He reads the surface the way I read a trail. He sees what the rock is going to do before he touches it." Maren was cleaning a chisel. "I know. You know that's not something you can teach." "I know that too." She examined the edge. "Which is why I'm teaching him everything else. The rest was already there." She said it matter-of-factly the way she stated structural observations. But it carried more weight than she let show because she had spent 3 years wondering whether what she knew could be transmitted or whether it would end with her. Theodore Hatch was the answer to a question she had never asked aloud. The community hall was completed in October 1882. Its dedication was quiet, no band, no imported refreshments. People simply coming to walk through it and put their hands on the walls the way you touch something you want to understand. Agnes Finley had already claimed a section of the interior left wall for a treatment station equipped with a carved stone shelf at a height she had specified 3 months earlier when Maren asked her without preamble what working height she preferred. Roy Pratt filed the community hall's documentation with care that exceeded his ordinary practice. He had been among the first people reached in the post-storm excavations found alone in his office on day 2. His filing system organized his land records wrapped in oilcloth. Maren had found this genuinely moving when Elliot reported it. It was the action of a man who understood his function and performed it under conditions that would have caused most people to abandon function entirely in favor of survival. 2 days after the dedication, Pratt came to Lodgestone Shelf with an amended filing form. The county was waiving fees for reconstruction-related property claims that year. He was offering to update her registration to reflect the full extent of her improvements. She took the paperwork, completed it the same afternoon with a technical summary that ran to 4 pages, every carved room, every water channel modification, every anchor ring installation, the secondary basin, the storage passage expansion. Pratt read all 4 pages before filing, making small sounds of recognition at intervals. When he finished, "I should have charged you more than $4. Maren looked at him with something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same space. "You charge what something is worth before it exists. That's a different number than what it's worth after." He stamped the filing. As she turned to leave, he mentioned that 3 families had been inquiring about North Cliff sections. She told him to send them to Elliot, who had the survey maps. The letter from Sweetwater Gorge, Wyoming, arrived in the spring of 1883, not from Robert Kane, whose name appeared on the envelope, but from a young woman named Delia Marsh, who had apparently written the letter and signed Kane's name to it because she believed a letter from the group's acknowledged leader would receive faster attention. She admitted this in the 3rd paragraph with the candid directness of someone who has decided that the strategy worked, and the explanation is therefore less embarrassing than it might otherwise be. She had read Elliot's notes distributing bound copies across mountain communities since the previous winter at no cost, and she had been studying the principles for 8 months. She had questions that the notes could not answer. She wanted to come to Harrow Creek. The group arrived the following June, 7 people on horseback led by Robert Kane, a practical man in his 40s, whose manner communicated high efficiency and low tolerance for decorative conversation. Among the 7 was Delia Marsh, 24 years old, a working mason from a family of Wyoming ranchers with hands that told the same story her occupation did. When Maren began working on the library extension without addressing the group, the other 6 settled onto whatever surfaces were available with the patience of people who had traveled to observe. Delia Marsh opened a small notebook and began sketching. Maren worked for 40 minutes. At no point did she explain what she was doing. The cut she was executing required sustained concentration, following a fracture line in the sandstone that had to be understood before it could be used rather than worked around. At the 40-minute mark, she set down the chisel, examined the result, looked at Delia's notebook. The sketch was technically detailed competent wrong in one specific way. The angle of chisel contact had been rendered as steeper than it actually was by approximately 10 degrees, not a large error, large enough to matter. Maren crossed the ledge, took the notebook from Delia's hands without asking permission, not rudely but in the manner of a teacher who understands that the fastest path between a misconception and its correction is directness. Held it up beside the wall, pointed to the discrepancy. The angle flattens as the cut deepens. You drew the initial contact. You stopped observing at the moment of commitment. She handed the notebook back. Watch the full stroke. Delia looked at the sketch at the wall, at the sketch again. Her expression was not embarrassment. It was the particular focus of someone who has just identified precisely what they have been missing. Again, a question, but barely. Maren picked up the chisel. This was the moment the whole story had been moving toward without announcing itself. Not the rescue of people from the snow, which was the dramatic peak. Not the community meeting, which was the civic turning point. This, a woman of 24, with the right instinct watching a woman of 47, with the right knowledge and the knowledge crossing the space between them in the form of a single corrected angle. The inheritance was not a building. The inheritance was a way of seeing. Eliot finished the revised manuscript that winter. He had expanded the original 44-page technical document into something that occupied the border between engineering manual and historical argument, a book that made the case through evidence rather than advocacy. That the failures of mountain settlements in the American West were not primarily failures of resources or will, but failures of attention. The refusal to learn from landscape rather than imposing upon it. He sent the manuscript to the Denver printer in the spring of 1884 with a note requesting 350 copies, still at no charge for distribution, adding that a chapter on community resource management during extended emergencies had been largely written by Agnes Finley, who had refused attribution but who would not, he suspected, refuse the satisfaction of seeing her methodology in print. The printer printed 350 copies. He charged cost only on the principle that some books were worth losing money on. Delia Marsh returned to Sweetwater Gorge that summer and began the first of what would become 7 construction projects over the following decade, applying the principles she had taken from Harrow Creek to canyon formations in Wyoming and southern Montana. She wrote to Maren twice a year. The letters were technical, specific, written in the handwriting of someone who had taught herself precision through practice rather than instruction. Maren answered every letter, her replies shorter than Delia's questions, but containing consistently exactly the information the questions needed, no more framed in the language of decision rather than procedure. Theodore Hatch began teaching his own small group of students in 1889, the first person in Harrow Creek to pass the method to others who had not learned it directly from Maren. She attended one session unannounced, sitting on a rock at the periphery of the group. She watched him correct a student's chisel angle, firm, specific, demonstrating rather than describing. She watched him stand back after the correction and let the student work without hovering. She watched him notice when the student's next cut incorporated the correction and say nothing about it, no praise, which would have shifted the student's attention from the stone to the instructor's approval. She stood up before the session ended, before Theodore saw her, and walked back up the ledge path. He found out she had been there from one of his students 2 days later. The knowledge settled in him differently than a compliment would have settled, deeper, without the warmth, but also without the volatility. It felt like evidence, which was what he had actually been working toward. Cornelius Hatch's later years were quieter than his earlier ones, and this suited him in ways that the earlier ones had not. He had rebuilt his financial standing through careful lending, evaluating construction projects now with the eye of someone who understood the difference between materials chosen for appearance and materials chosen for thermal performance, which turned out to be exactly the knowledge needed to distinguish between loans likely to produce returns and loans likely to produce losses. He lived in a 3-room stone house on the north cliff face, southwest exposure, built over 2 summers with Theodore's help on the sections that required technical precision beyond what Cornelius had yet developed. The east room had an angular irregularity that any trained mason would catch immediately, a wall that departed from plumb by nearly 3 degrees over its height, producing a slightly trapezoidal space that no furniture arrangement could entirely disguise. Hatch had decided not to correct it. He told Theodore it was a reminder. Theodore, who understood what kind of reminder it was, did not suggest that a reminder of this nature was harder on visitors than on the man it was meant to serve. On an October afternoon in 1890, Hatch came to Lodgestone Shelf to return a book he had borrowed from Eliot, a volume on Roman Hipparcos systems relevant to a hearth configuration project he was attempting in the community hall. He found Maren alone, Eliot having gone to the valley to meet the monthly supply delivery. She was sitting in the chair by the south window with her hands open in her lap, not working, not reading. The afternoon light was going amber over the valley below. The scrub oak on the talus slopes had turned. The creek glinted in the low sun. He set the book on the table. He looked around the room, the water basin flowing in its carved channel, the walls holding their warmth in the October afternoon, the stone floor polished to smoothness by 12 years of feet. He had been in this room perhaps a dozen times since the storm. Each time it struck him as the same thing, not impressive, not beautiful in any conventional vocabulary, but correct. Exactly what it needed to be built by someone who understood exactly what it needed to be for reasons that had nothing to do with what it would look like from the street below. "Do you ever think about leaving?" His voice carried genuine curiosity rather than leading anywhere particular. Maren looked at the south window where the October light was doing what October light in the Colorado high country does, turning everything it touched to a color between gold and loss. "I'm part of this rock now." A pause. "You don't leave something you've become part of." He considered this for a moment. "The rock doesn't know that." "No." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but occupying the adjacent space. "That's what makes it honest." He left the book, walked back down the path to the valley floor, his footsteps steady on the worn stone steps. In the summer of 1912, 3 months before Eliot's death, Delia Marsh came back to Harrow Creek for the first time in 4 years. She was 52, her face carrying the evidence of 2 decades of outdoor work in mountain weather. She came not to report success, but to report a partial failure. One of her 7 Wyoming structures, built in 1905, had not performed as expected through the previous winter. No one had been harmed. The thermal performance had simply been insufficient. In the 3 coldest weeks of January, temperatures inside dropping lower than her calculations had predicted, and the family occupying the space had been uncomfortable rather than warm. She spread her drawings on Eliot's table. Maren studied them for 2 days without comment, tracing the layout with her finger, sitting with the plans, the way she sat with stone, not rushing to conclusion, but waiting for the material to reveal the problem. On the evening of the 2nd day, she found it. The sleeping chamber had been positioned on the northeast side of the structure rather than deeper into the cliff face. The reason was immediately apparent from the notes Delia had attached. The occupying family had specified that they wanted a window facing the valley. Maren set the drawing down. "You gave them the view." Delia's jaw tightened slightly. "They asked for it specifically. They had seen the Harwick family's unit, which has a northeast window. The Harwick unit has 3 feet more cliff depth on the sleeping chamber's east wall. The window is the same size. The thermal mass compensates." She tapped the relevant wall on Delia's drawing. "Here it doesn't. You were working with a shallower formation." Delia studied the drawing for a long moment. "I knew the formation was shallower. I thought the window size would offset it." "The window doesn't offset. The window subtracts." Maren looked at her not harshly, but with the directness she had always used when the situation required it. "Next time you tell them I can give you a view that doesn't cost warmth, but I need to place the window on the south face and frame it with a deep reveal. Same light, different placement. They get what they want. The stone gets what it needs. Delia wrote this in her notebook. Then she looked up. What do I do about the existing structure? Add a thermal mass partition on the northeast wall, 8 inches of mortared stone freestanding. It won't be perfect. It will be sufficient. Maren handed the drawing back. Sufficient is what most problems actually require. Perfect is what we aim for when we have the formation for it. This exchange would be reproduced imperfectly in Delia's own teaching over the following decades, losing some precision at each transmission and gaining some authority the way all knowledge travels through time. Knowledge is not a building. It does not maintain itself through inertia. It requires the same thing the buildings required: someone paying attention, making corrections, following the grain, rather than fighting it. Eliot died on a warm night in August 1912. He was 75 years old and had been slowing for 2 years in the way of a man whose mind remained fully occupied while his body began the process of quietly standing down. His last journal entry was a note on a modification he had been considering for the water channel's winter flow, a small adjustment to the intake angle that he believed would prevent the partial freezing that occurred in January's coldest weeks. Not a valediction, not a summation, just the next thing he had been thinking about written down, because he wrote things down. Maren found him in the morning. She sat with him for an hour before she went down the path to tell anyone. What she did in that hour, she placed her left hand, the one missing its fingertip, the one that had first struck stone at age 11, the one that had carved these rooms over 14 months in 1878 and 1879, flat against the wall beside the sleeping room door. She held it there. The stone was warm with stored summer heat, releasing it in the patient, indiscriminate way it had released heat through 34 winters of their occupation, making no distinction between the comfort of 2 people or the comfort of 1. She did not speak. She was not a person who spoke to stone in the way of superstition or sentiment. She spoke to stone by working it, by reading it, by building according to what it told her. This was something different, a woman holding the material that had held her life in place on the morning the life required additional holding. She went down the path an hour later and told Thomas Harwick, who was 30 years old now and one of the most skilled masons in the Southern Rockies, and who received the news with the stillness of a man who had understood for some time that this morning was coming. Maren died in January 1913 in the sleeping room carved into the cliff that she had chosen in the spring of 1878 because it faced the right direction. The stone floor was warm. The south window was showing the pale light of a January afternoon over the valley below where Harrow Creek had been rebuilt in the image of the principles she had spent 35 years embodying. Thomas Harwick sat with her through the last afternoon. He did not try to fill the silence with anything the silence did not require. In the pocket of her coat, folded in quarters, was a drawing. Thomas found it when he was preparing to go down the path. He unfolded it carefully, a pencil sketch on the back of an old survey form, the handwriting at its margins in Maren's compressed, precise hand. It was a building, a large one, a community structure on the north cliff face with space for 30 people, a full water system, a southern exposure, achieved through a geometry that required a particular kind of natural alcove formation that existed on the north face but had never been used. The design was not finished. Several dimensions were missing. 2 of the structural connections were marked with question marks rather than specifications. He stood in the main room of Lodgestone Shelf for a long time with the drawing in his hands. Then he went down the path, found Delia Marsh, who was staying at the Harwick family's cliff dwelling for the week, and gave her the drawing without explanation. She took it, unfolded it, examined it in the January light coming through the south window. She said nothing for several minutes. Then she folded it back along its original creases and put it in the inner pocket of her coat close to her chest where the warmth of her body would keep the paper from becoming brittle in the cold. 3 years later, in May of 1916, at the North Cliff face of Harrow Creek Valley, a building was completed. Theodore Hatch, Delia Marsh, 4 students who had learned the method through the chain of instruction. Maren had started 38 years earlier. They finished it on a Thursday afternoon in clear weather, the kind of Colorado spring day that the high country produces occasionally, as if to remind everyone what the landscape looks like when it is not trying to kill you. The structure held 30 people comfortably. The thermal performance exceeded the design specifications. The southern-facing geometry worked precisely as the pencil sketch had imagined it. Above the entrance, Delia cut the inscription herself, not copying it from Lodgestone Shelf, where Eliot had carved it in 1882, but rendering it fresh as though each word needed to be re-earned by the hand cutting it. The stone does not forgive or condemn. It simply endures. Build accordingly. Below that, in letters half the size and handwriting that anyone who had received one of her technical letters would have recognized immediately, and teach accordingly. Below that, smaller still, the year 1916. The stone held all three lines with equal indifference. It did not distinguish between the wisdom of the first and the addition of the second. It held them the way it held everything committed to it, with sufficient depth and sufficient care, without preference, without opinion, without any interest in who received the credit. In the valley below, Harrow Creek had been rebuilt differently from what it had been in 1878. Lower buildings on the valley floor, wider spaced with heavy eaved roof lines, designed to shed load rather than accumulate it. Cliff dwellings on both faces accessible by carved stone stairs that would remain navigable through any winter the elevation could produce. The community hall on the north face used every week. The assay office rebuilt in stone. Gunnison Street narrower than before, lined with structures whose builders had understood what they were doing and why. The inscription above Lodgestone Shelf's entrance remained exactly as Eliot had cut it 34 years earlier, the letters worn smooth at their edges by decades of hands doing what people do when they pass something that matters, touching it without fully knowing why, registering its presence through the skin. The stone does not forgive or condemn, it simply endures. Build accordingly. Not wisdom about stone. A principle for living in a world that outlasts you, that was here before you arrived, that will continue after you are gone, that offers neither punishment nor reward, but only the consequences of what you actually did, carved into a permanence that does not negotiate and does not forget. The cliff held the words. The cliff held the warmth. The cliff held the memory of 35 years of a woman who had understood better than almost anyone in her time that the relationship between a person and the physical world is not one of conquest or surrender, but of sustained, humble, rigorous attention. The stone does not know this. That is precisely the point.